The autumn breeze rustled through the trees as a 12-year-old boy made his way home from the local library. His backpack was heavy with books about space and astronomy. He'd been researching for weeks to make his science project perfect. The setting sun cast long shadows on the peaceful suburban sidewalk as he walked, occasionally glancing up at the darkening sky and dreaming about the stars he would soon study. He was just 2 blocks from home when the police cruiser slowly pulled up beside him. The boy didn't think much of it at first. Police cars often patrolled their neighborhood, and he'd always been taught that officers were there to protect the community. But something felt different this time. The cruiser's pace matched his walking speed, following him in a way that made his heart begin to race. "Hey you, stop right there." The officer's voice boomed through the patrol car's speaker, making the boy jump. He immediately froze, his hands trembling slightly as he held onto his backpack straps. The police car door opened, and Officer Barrett stepped out, his hand resting on his belt as he approached. "Turn around slowly and keep your hands where I can see them," the officer commanded, his tone harsh and accusatory. The boy complied, his mind racing to understand what was happening. He could feel his heart pounding against his chest as the officer towered over him. "We've had reports of a shoplifter in the area," Officer Barrett said, his eyes narrowing as he looked the boy up and down. "Your description matches our suspect." The boy tried to explain that he'd been at the library all afternoon, working on his science project about the solar system. His voice came out smaller than he intended, shaking with fear and confusion. "I can show you my library card," the boy offered quietly, "and all my books are in my backpack." But Officer Barrett cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Don't reach for anything. Put the bag down slowly and step away from it." By now, people were beginning to notice. An elderly couple walking their dog stopped to watch. A woman watering her front garden turned off her hose and moved closer to her fence, her phone already in her hand. Cars slowed as they passed, some drivers openly staring at the scene unfolding on their usually quiet street. The boy felt tears welling up in his eyes, but fought to hold them back. He'd done nothing wrong. He was just walking home from the library like he did almost every week. But here he was, being treated like a criminal in his own neighborhood, just blocks from the house where he'd lived his entire life. "Sir, please," he tried again, his voice steadier this time despite his fear. "My mom is expecting me home. She's probably worried already. You can call her. She's a doctor at Central Hospital." But the officer seemed uninterested in his explanations. "Put your hands behind your back," Officer Barrett ordered, pulling out his handcuffs. The metal clicked cold against the boy's wrists as neighbors gathered on their porches, watching in stunned silence. The sound of more police sirens approached in the distance. As he stood there, the boy thought about all the times his parents had talked to him about staying calm, if something like this ever happened. He remembered his father's words: "Keep your dignity, know your rights, but most importantly, stay safe." So he stood there, trying to be brave, even as his astronomy books lay scattered on the sidewalk, even as curious onlookers began recording with their phones, even as tears finally escaped and rolled down his cheeks. The late afternoon light was fading now, casting long shadows across the scene. More residents emerged from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Some began making phone calls, their voices urgent and concerned. Others approached cautiously, phones recording, ensuring that whatever happened next would be documented. The boy closed his eyes for a moment, thinking of his mother's warm smile, his father's strong hugs, and the half-finished model of Saturn he'd left on his desk at home. He took a deep breath, trying to stay strong, knowing that soon, hopefully soon, the truth would come out. But for now, he stood there, a 12-year-old boy in handcuffs, his dreams of the stars temporarily grounded by the cold reality of prejudice. The crowd continued to grow as the young boy stood handcuffed on the sidewalk. The evening air had grown cooler, but he barely noticed, his mind racing with confusion and fear. Officer Barrett paced around him, speaking into his radio with sharp, clipped words about a suspect in custody. Each time the boy tried to speak, to explain about his library books and his science project, the officer would cut him off with a harsh "be quiet." A young woman in a blue blazer pushed through the gathering crowd. Her law textbooks were still clutched in her arms. She'd been studying at the coffee shop across the street when she noticed the commotion. Without hesitation, she pulled out her phone and began recording, making sure to capture clear footage while staying at a respectful distance. "Officer," she called out firmly, "I'm a law student, and I'd like to know the probable cause for detaining this child." Her voice was steady and professional, though her hands shook slightly as she held her phone. Other neighbors had their phones out too now, their concerned faces illuminated by their screens in the growing dusk. The boy's breathing came in short, quick bursts as he tried to remember everything his parents had taught him about staying calm. His shoulders ached from the uncomfortable position of the handcuffs, and his legs were getting tired from standing still for so long. Yet he remained quiet, knowing that speaking up might only make things worse. A second police car arrived, its lights casting red and blue shadows across the faces of the onlookers. The new officer approached more cautiously, taking in the scene: the scattered library books, the growing crowd of concerned neighbors, the law students still recording steadily, and the young boy standing perfectly still despite his obvious fear. "What seems to be the situation here?" the second officer asked, his tone notably different from Officer Barrett's harsh commands. Before Barrett could answer, an elderly neighbor stepped forward, her voice quavering with emotion. "I've known this boy since he was a baby," she said firmly. "He walks this route to the library every week. His mother is a doctor at Central Hospital. You can call her right now to verify everything." The boy felt a surge of gratitude for his neighbor's words, but it was quickly overshadowed by embarrassment as he realized how many people were watching him. Some cars had even stopped completely now, their drivers getting out to see what was happening. He could hear whispers, phone calls being made, and the constant sound of Officer Barrett's boots on the concrete as he continued to pace. There was a shoplifting incident reported, Officer Barrett defended, but his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. The second officer glanced at the library books scattered on the ground, then back at the boy's school uniform and the astronomy club patch on his backpack. Just then, a voice crackled over both officers' radios. "Suspect in the shoplifting case has been apprehended at the mall. Adult male, approximately 30 years old." The rest of the message faded into static, but its impact was immediate. The crowd began murmuring louder, and the law student stepped closer, still recording. "Officer," she said clearly, "given that the actual suspect has been apprehended, there's no longer any reason, if there ever was one, to detain this child. He should be released immediately." The second officer moved toward the boy, reaching for his keys. "Let's get these cuffs off," he said quietly, but Officer Barrett interrupted, stepping between them. "We still need to verify his identity, and—" Barrett began, but was cut off by a new voice that rang out across the scene. A voice filled with both authority and barely contained fury. "That's my son." The crowd parted as a woman in medical scrubs rushed forward, her hospital ID badge still clipped to her pocket, her face a mixture of concern and controlled anger. The boy felt tears of relief spring to his eyes at the sight of his mother, but he stood tall, just as she had always taught him to do. The next few moments would change everything, not just for the boy and Officer Barrett, but for their entire community. The mother's presence transformed the entire scene. Still wearing her hospital scrubs from her shift at Central Hospital, she moved with the calm precision that came from years of handling emergencies. But anyone watching could see the controlled fury in her eyes as she approached her handcuffed son. "I got 3 calls about my son being detained on my way home," she said, her voice steady, but carrying an edge that made even Officer Barrett take a small step back. "Would someone like to explain why my 12-year-old is in handcuffs after spending his afternoon at the library?" The second officer moved forward to speak, but she held up her hand, silencing him with a look that she usually reserved for misbehaving interns at the hospital. "First, take those handcuffs off my son. Now." This time, Officer Barrett didn't try to interfere as his colleague quickly moved to remove the handcuffs. The boy rubbed his wrists, fighting back tears as his mother pulled him close for a quick hug before positioning herself protectively in front of him. "Now," she continued, pulling out her phone, "I've already spoken to our family lawyer. He's on his way. But before he gets here, I want to understand exactly what probable cause you've had for detaining my son." Her words were precise, clinical, the same tone she used when questioning decisions in her hospital rounds. The crowd had grown quieter, but phones were still recording. The law student who'd been documenting everything stepped forward, offering to share her footage. "I've been recording since I noticed the detention, ma'am. I caught everything, including the radio call about the real suspect being caught at the mall." Officer Barrett's face reddened. "We were responding to a shoplifting report," he began, but the mother cut him off. "A shoplifting report?" She looked pointedly at the library books scattered on the ground, then at her son's school uniform and his astronomy club badge. "And this looked like your suspect? A child carrying library books? My son, who has been going to this same library every week for the past 3 years." The elderly neighbor who had spoken up earlier approached again, this time carrying the boy's fallen books. "We all know your son here," she said kindly, handing him his astronomy textbook. "Always polite, always studying. Officer Barrett here wouldn't listen to any of us." The mother's eyes narrowed at the mention of the officer's name. "Barrett," she repeated, as if memorizing it. "Well, Officer Barrett, I hope you're prepared to explain your actions to more than just me. Because this," she gestured to the crowd, the phones, her shaken but dignified son, "this ends today." The second officer, clearly trying to defuse the situation, stepped forward. "Ma'am, we apologize for any misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding?" The mother's laugh was sharp. "Let's be very clear about what happened here. My son was racially profiled, detained without cause, and handcuffed in his own neighborhood while carrying library books. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a violation of his civil rights." The boy watched his mother in awe. This was different from her usual gentle demeanor at home. This was the strength she'd always told him about, the kind that came from knowing you're right and refusing to back down. "You know what my son was doing today?" she continued, her voice carrying across the now silent crowd. "He was researching for his science project. He wants to be an astronaut. He's 12 years old, dreaming about exploring space, and instead of encouraging that dream, you put him in handcuffs because of what? Because he fits some vague description, or because of something else." A police supervisor's car pulled up to the scene, followed closely by a sleek black sedan. The family's lawyer had arrived. The mother stood straighter, if that was possible. "This isn't over," she said quietly, but with absolute conviction. "What happened here tonight isn't just about my son. It's about every child who looks like him, who dreams like him, who deserves better than this." She turned to the gathering of neighbors, her voice strong and clear. "Thank you all for being here, for recording, for speaking up. This is how change begins, when a community stands together and says enough." The next morning, the local police station buzzed with unusual activity. The family's lawyer had wasted no time in requesting all surveillance footage from the area where the incident took place. What emerged from these videos would change everything. The first piece of evidence came from the library's security cameras. Clear footage showed the boy spending his afternoon exactly where he said he had been, sitting at a study table surrounded by astronomy books, occasionally looking up at the ceiling as if imagining the stars above. The timestamp matched perfectly with his story. But it was the footage from the shopping district that truly turned the tide. The security cameras from 3 different stores painted a crystal clear picture. At the exact time the boy was being detained on his walk home, the actual shoplifting suspect, A grown man wearing a red jacket was being caught at the mall nearly 2 miles away. "Look at these timestamps," the police chief said, reviewing the footage with Internal Affairs. His face grew more troubled with each video he watched. On one screen, they could see the boy walking peacefully with his backpack. On another, the actual suspect was running from store security. The times overlapped perfectly. The local news had already picked up the story. Breaking news. Security footage reveals wrongful detention of honor student, the headlines read. The videos from neighbors' phones had spread across social media, showing the boy standing bravely in handcuffs while Officer Barrett paced around him. More evidence emerged as the investigation deepened. A review of the original shoplifting report revealed something disturbing. The suspect description mentioned a man in his 30s. There was never any mention of a child or a backpack. Officer Barrett had completely disregarded the actual description. The boy's mother sat in the police chief's office, watching the security footage with steady eyes. Her lawyer took careful notes beside her. "So," she said calmly, though her hands were tightly clasped, "would you agree that there was absolutely no justification for detaining my son?" The police chief rubbed his forehead, looking older than he had at the start of the day. "No justification at all," he admitted. "The evidence is overwhelmingly clear. Your son was wrongfully detained, and we as a department failed him." But it wasn't just about one incident anymore. The investigation had opened a door that couldn't be closed. Other community members began coming forward with their own stories about Officer Barrett. A pattern emerged, one that should have been noticed long ago. The local coffee shop's cameras had captured the entire scene from a different angle. In the footage, you could clearly see the law student recording, the elderly neighbor trying to intervene, and most importantly, the moment when the radio call about the real suspect came through. Officer Barrett's body camera, which he had failed to turn off, caught his mumbled response. "I still think this one's up to something." Those words, caught clearly on camera, echoed through the police station's halls. They were words that couldn't be explained away or justified. They revealed the truth that everyone had known but couldn't prove, until now. The boy's father, who had been away on a business trip during the incident, stood in the police station watching the footage. His face showed the pain of every parent who has to witness their child being treated unjustly. "My son," he said quietly, "wants to explore space someday. He dreams about seeing the stars up close. But how can he reach for the stars when people like Officer Barrett try to put his dreams in handcuffs?" The evidence was irrefutable. The security footage, the body camera audio, the witness videos, the incorrect suspect description. It all pointed to one undeniable conclusion. This wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. This was a clear case of prejudice, caught on camera from multiple angles, impossible to deny or explain away. The truth had finally come to light, captured frame by the unblinking eyes of security cameras and the brave witnesses who refused to stay silent. Now, the question wasn't about what happened. The footage made that clear. The question was, what would be done about it? The Internal Affairs investigation room felt heavy with tension as investigators reviewed case after case. What started as an investigation into one incident had quickly grown into something much larger. On the wall, a timeline was forming, not just of the boy's detention, but of similar incidents spanning Officer Barrett's 15-year career. "Look at this pattern," said the lead investigator, pinning another complaint to the board. Her hands moved swiftly, connecting threads between incidents that should have been noticed years ago. How did we miss this for so long? The investigation had attracted attention from the highest levels of the department. The police chief himself sat in on many of the interviews, his face growing more concerned with each new revelation. This wasn't just about one officer anymore. It was about a system that had allowed these incidents to go unchecked. Down the hall, two younger officers who had witnessed the incident sat waiting to give their statements. "I knew something wasn't right," one whispered to the other. "The way Barrett just zeroed in on that kid, we should have spoken up sooner." The boy's mother had provided the hospital records of her shift that day, proving she'd been called away from treating patients because of the wrongful detention of her son. "I've taught my son to trust the police," she told the investigators, her voice steady but hurt. "How do I explain to him why this happened?" The law student's video had been played countless times in the investigation room. Each viewing revealed new details. The tremor in the boy's voice as he tried to explain about his library books, the way Officer Barrett ignored the elderly neighbor's attempts to verify the boy's identity, the crucial moment when the radio call about the real suspect came through. But something unexpected was happening too. Other officers, especially younger ones, began coming forward. They shared stories of times they'd seen Barrett's behavior and felt uncomfortable but hadn't known how to report it. Some even admitted their own biases and asked for help in addressing them. "We need to change how we handle these situations," one veteran officer said during his interview. "I've been on the force for 20 years, and this isn't what we're supposed to be about." The internal affairs team worked late into the night, reviewing body camera footage from Barrett's past incidents. They found a pattern of selective enforcement, of stops made with flimsy justification, of reports written to justify actions after the fact. Each piece of evidence added to a picture that could no longer be ignored. The boy's father had provided a letter to the investigation team. "My son studies the stars," he wrote. "He believes in exploring the unknown, in reaching for something greater than ourselves. Shouldn't our police force share that same vision? Shouldn't they strive to lift people up rather than hold them down?" Progress came in small but significant steps. The department began implementing immediate changes even as the investigation continued. Body cameras had to stay on for entire shifts. Any detention of a minor required immediate supervisor notification. Anonymous reporting systems were set up for officers to report concerns about their colleagues. The boy, still working on his astronomy project at home, didn't know about all these changes happening at the police station. But he noticed something different when he walked to the library now. Other officers would smile and wave, some even asking about his project. One young officer, herself a former astronomy student, stopped to talk about constellations. In the Internal Affairs office, the lead investigator put down her pen after another long day. The evidence was clear, the pattern undeniable. Officer Barrett's actions weren't just an isolated incident. They were symptoms of a larger problem that needed to be addressed. But for the first time in years, real change seemed possible. The investigation was far from over, but its impact was already rippling through the department. In trying to understand how one officer could wrongfully detain a young boy carrying astronomy books, they had uncovered something much bigger, and the chance to make real, lasting change. 2 weeks after the incident, something unexpected happened at the community center. The boy's mother stood at a podium, but she wasn't there to demand justice or express anger. Instead, she was presenting a plan, one that could change how police and community members interact forever. "We have a choice," she told the packed room, her voice clear and determined. "We can let this incident divide us, or we can use it to build something better." Behind her, a screen showed pictures of community events, training sessions, and youth programs she had helped design. The crowd included both police officers and local residents. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, not sure what to expect. But as the boy's mother continued speaking, the tension in the room began to fade. She wasn't just talking about what went wrong. She was showing them how to make things right. The boy himself had surprised everyone with his response to the incident. Instead of letting fear take over, he had started a club at his school called Know Your Rights and Reach for the Stars. The club combined his love for astronomy with lessons about civil rights and community engagement. "When I look up at the stars," he told his classmates during their first meeting, "I see possibilities. Maybe we can help make those same possibilities exist down here on Earth." His astronomy teacher, watching from the doorway, had to wipe away tears. The police department had taken unprecedented steps too. The new training program, developed with input from community leaders, wasn't just about what officers shouldn't do. It was about building real connections. Officers began attending science fairs, sports events, and community gatherings not as security, but as participants. One young officer, after listening to the boy talk about his dream of becoming an astronaut, organized a field trip to the local planetarium. "We need to be part of building dreams," she said, "not breaking them down." The sight of police officers sitting with kids under the projected stars, all of them asking questions about space, made local news headlines. The boy's father had taken action too. Using his business connections, he helped create internship programs that brought young people into contact with police officers in positive ways. Together, they worked on community projects, learning to see each other as people first, not just roles or uniforms. During one community meeting, something powerful happened. The elderly neighbor who had tried to help during the incident stood up to speak. "I've lived here for 40 years, she said, her voice shaking slightly. "And this is the first time I've felt like real change might be possible." The law student who had recorded the incident now led workshops teaching young people about their rights, but she didn't do it alone. Several police officers had volunteered to help, explaining procedures from their perspective while acknowledging the need for accountability. Even some of Officer Barrett's former colleagues came forward to be part of the change. "We can't change what happened," one veteran officer said during a training session, "but we can make sure it never happens again." His words became a kind of motto for the department's reform efforts. The boy's mother hadn't stopped at local change. She began speaking at other police departments, sharing their community's story and the positive changes that had grown from it. "Every challenge is an opportunity," she would tell them. "The question is whether we're brave enough to take it." Back at the community center, the boy set up his completed astronomy project, a model of the solar system that included both the planets and quotes about justice surrounding them. "Space teaches us that everything is connected," he explained to visitors. "What happens to one of us affects all of us." The changes weren't perfect, and everyone knew there was still work to be done. But something fundamental had shifted. A wrongful detention hadn't just led to punishment. It had sparked a movement toward understanding, growth, and real community connection. 1 month after the incident, the police department looked different. Not just on the surface, but deep down where it really mattered. The changes started small. A new bulletin board in the break room filled with community event flyers, officers attending training sessions with genuine interest rather than just checking boxes. The biggest change came in how they handled daily operations. Every morning briefing now included a review of positive community interactions alongside the usual crime reports. Officers shared stories of connections they'd made, problems they'd solved without force, and moments of understanding they'd achieved. The new oversight board met in a bright room with windows facing the street. It wasn't just for show. Community members and officers sat together, reviewing policies and suggesting improvements. The boy's mother attended these meetings not as an angry parent, but as someone helping to rebuild trust. "Yesterday, I saw something I never expected," one board member shared during a meeting. An officer stopped to help some kids with their basketball game. Just a few months ago, those same kids would have run away when they saw a police car. The mandatory bias training had transformed too. Instead of dry lectures, officers now participated in real conversations with community members. They listened to stories, shared their own experiences, and worked together to understand different perspectives. Some officers who had initially resisted the training became its strongest supporters. "I've been on the force for 18 years, one senior officer told his younger colleagues. "But I learned more about real policing in these past few weeks than in all those years combined." His words carried extra weight because everyone knew he had once been Officer Barrett's partner. The early warning system they implemented wasn't just about catching bad behavior, it was about supporting good policing. Officers who showed exceptional community engagement became mentors. Those who struggled received help before small problems became big ones. The focus shifted from punishment to prevention and growth. In the dispatch center, new protocols took effect. Any call involving young people now required additional verification before action could be taken. Dispatchers were trained to gather more detailed information and to challenge vague or potentially biased descriptions. Officer Barrett's case had finished its review. The results weren't just about one officer's actions anymore. They had led to a complete overhaul of department policies. We're not just changing rules, the police chief explained to local reporters. We're changing our entire approach to community safety. The Boys Astronomy Club had grown, and surprisingly, several officers had become regular visitors. They didn't come in uniform, but rather as members of the community interested in learning about space. One officer, a former science teacher, even helped with experiments. During a community feedback session, a teenager stood up to share her story. "Last week, I was walking home late from study group," she said. "A police car stopped beside me, and I felt scared. But the officer just asked if I wanted a safety escort home. That's the kind of change we needed." The department's training academy looked different now, too. New recruits learned about community history alongside police procedures. They met with local families, participated in neighborhood events, and understood that their role was to protect dreams, not destroy them. Even the physical space of the police station had changed. The walls now display artwork from local schools, including the Boys Solar System project. "Every time we look at these stars," one officer said, "we remember why we're here, to help our community reach higher." The reform wasn't just about rules and regulations. It was about changing hearts and minds. Officers who had once seen their job as simply enforcing law now understood their deeper role in the community. They weren't just protecting streets. They were protecting possibilities. 2 months after the incident, something remarkable happened at the community center. People gathered for what they called a healing circle, an idea that came from both the police department and community leaders. The room was arranged with chairs in a circle, erasing the usual barriers between police and residents. The boy and his parents were there, sitting near some officers who had recently completed the new training program. The tension that might have existed weeks ago had softened into something different, not quite comfort, but a willingness to listen and understand. "I never thought I'd be sitting here," one officer admitted, his voice quiet but clear in the packed room. "When I first joined the force, I thought our job was simple. Catch the bad guys, protect the good guys. But life isn't that simple, is it?" He looked at the boy, then at his own hands. "Sometimes our assumptions hurt the very people we're supposed to protect." The boy's mother spoke next, her words measured and thoughtful. "For years, I taught my son that police officers were his friends. After what happened, he asked me if that was still true." She paused, looking around the circle. "Today, I can tell him that while some people might let us down, there are always others willing to stand up and make things right." Even some officers who had initially defended Officer Barrett came to share their changed perspectives. One veteran cop stood up, his voice shaking slightly. "I've known Barrett for 15 years, he said. "I made excuses for him because that seemed easier than facing the truth. I was wrong. To this young man and his family, I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner." The law student who had recorded the incident shared her own journey. "I started recording because I was angry," she admitted. "But now I'm working with the police department to train new officers. Change is possible when we're brave enough to face our mistakes and learn from them." The boy himself had grown in unexpected ways. No longer just the quiet kid who loved astronomy. He had become a bridge between his peers and the police. "I still want to explore space someday," he told the group. "But now I also want to help explore ways we can make Earth better too." During a break, people shared refreshments and talked in small groups. The elderly neighbor who had tried to help during the incident was deep in conversation with a young officer about community gardens. Another officer was showing kids how the buttons on his radio worked, demystifying the equipment that had once seemed threatening. The healing wasn't just happening in organized meetings. Around town, small moments showed how things were changing. Officers stopped to chat with kids about their school projects. Community members waved at patrol cars instead of tensing up. The wall between us and them was slowly crumbling. One of the most powerful moments came when a group of officers attended the boys' astronomy presentation at school. They sat in the audience, not as authority figures, but as community members supporting a young person's dreams. The boys' presentation included a section about how, like the stars, communities shine brighter when they work together. The police chief, who had been quietly observing these changes, finally spoke up during one session. Law enforcement isn't just about enforcing laws, he said. It's about building a community where everyone feels safe to reach for their dreams. What happened to this young man showed us how far we had strayed from that mission. But his courage and his family's wisdom helped us find our way back. As the evening wound down, people lingered, reluctant to leave the space of understanding they had created. The boy's father watched his son teaching a young officer about constellations, using the star chart he brought from home. Sometimes, he said to no one in particular, the darkest moments lead us to the brightest stars. 1 year later, the changes that began with one wrongful detention had grown into something remarkable. The local police department had become a model for others across the country. News crews occasionally visited, hoping to understand how a painful incident had transformed into a story of hope and change. The boy, now 13, stood at a podium receiving the Youth Leadership Award. The audience included police officers, community members, and students from his astronomy club, which had grown to include kids from several local schools. His voice was steady as he spoke about his experience. "A year ago, I was just a kid who loved looking at the stars," he said, holding his award. "I never thought I'd be standing here. But sometimes the worst moments in our lives can lead to the best changes, if we're brave enough to make them happen." The statistics told part of the story. Complaints against officers had dropped by 60%. Community trust ratings had risen to their highest levels ever. Other police departments sent officers to learn from their new training programs. But the real changes were visible in everyday moments. At the corner store where the original shoplifting call had come from, the owner now knew most of the officers by name. They stopped in regularly, not to patrol, but to chat with customers and share community news. The store had become a place where kids felt comfortable asking officers questions about their jobs. The law student who recorded the incident had graduated and now worked with the department's legal team, helping to shape policies that protected both officers and citizens. Her video of that day was used in training sessions, not as an example of shame, but as a turning point that led to positive change. The boy's mother had been recognized for her work in community policing reform. She traveled to other cities, sharing their story and helping other departments learn from their experience. "Change isn't just about new rules," she would tell them. "It's about new ways of seeing each other." Even the physical neighborhood had transformed. The spot where the detention happened now featured a small community garden, tended jointly by police officers and local residents. Every spring, they planted flowers that bloomed in the department's colors, a symbol of growth from difficult ground. The Boys' Astronomy Club had inspired similar groups in other schools. Police officers often visited as guest speakers, not to talk about law enforcement, but to share their own interests in science and space. One officer, inspired by the boys' passion, had gone back to school to study physics. The elderly neighbor who had spoken up during the incident now led a community advisory board. "A year ago, I was just someone watching from my porch," she told a reporter. "Now I'm helping make sure our voices are heard in every decision that affects our neighborhood." The police department itself looked different. Photos of community events lined the halls alongside the usual official portraits. The break room hosted regular meetings between officers and residents. The us versus them mentality had been replaced by a sense of shared purpose. During the year's first snowfall, something special happened. Officers and kids had an impromptu snowball fight in the park. Parents who once would have hurried their children away instead joined in, laughing alongside the officers. Someone took a photo that went viral, a perfect snapshot of what community policing could be. The boy still looked at the stars every night, but now he saw them differently. Space teaches us that everything is connected, he explained to a group of younger kids at his club. What happens to one of us affects all of us. That's true out there in the cosmos, and it's true right here in our neighborhood. As he finished his award speech, he pointed to the back of the room where a special display stood, his astronomy project now permanently housed in the community center. Next to it hung a framed photo of that difficult day, alongside a timeline of the positive changes that followed. Sometimes, he concluded, his voice strong and clear, it takes darkness to help us see the stars more clearly. But it's what we do after the darkness that really matters.